Not much is going well for Libya's rebels lately, but today they scored one success. A tanker carrying crude oil left the eastern port of Tobruk, the first known export shipment by the opposition. However, on the battlefield, the opposition has been knocked back on its heels. Each advance is followed by a retreat. CNN's Ben Wiedemann is in eastern Libya.
Anti-Gaddafi forces continue to take a pounding in eastern Libya. Yesterday, we saw them being pushed back 40 kilometers, 25 miles from Brega to about halfway between Brega and Ashdabia. They say it's been days now since there was any sort of coalition or NATO airstrike against Gaddafi's forces. This despite the fact that Abdel Fattah Yunus, the head of the opposition army, says that they give NATO regular updates on the positions of Libyan forces in this part of the country. NATO says one of the problems is the weather is not ideal for airstrikes, but even though today is cloudy, by and large, visibility is good. Another worry of NATO is that Libyan forces are hiding among civilians, but the opposition argues there's still the supply lines that are easy targets for those aircraft. And of course, they'll point to things like this. This is a tank outside of the town of Ashdabia that was hit 2.5 weeks ago by French aircraft. And this area is scattered with similar examples of what NATO could do if it had the will to do it. But the Libyan opposition is saying they're worried that will just isn't there. I'm Ben Wiedemann, reporting from outside Ashdabia in eastern Libya.
Now a stunning back and forth between Gaddafi and the Obama administration. The Libyan leader writes directly to President Obama with a personal appeal. Let's go straight to our foreign affairs correspondent, Jill Doherty. She's working this part of the story for us. Jill?
Wolf, you know, there's a certain surreal quality to all of this. In the midst of a war with the international community demanding that he stop the violence and step down, Muammar Gaddafi writes a bizarre letter to President Barack Obama. In his rambling 3-page letter to President Barack Obama, the Libyan leader says, regardless of the hurt the U.S. has caused Libya, quote, "You will always remain our son, whatever happened." Gaddafi urges Mr. Obama to stop the NATO air campaign, which he calls an unjust war against a small people of a developing country. Libya, he says, has been morally damaged by the NATO campaign more than physically. But Gaddafi makes no offer to step down or to negotiate in that letter. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton dismissed the message, saying Gaddafi knows what he must do: leave power and leave Libya.
I don't think there is any mystery about what is expected from Mr. Gaddafi at this time. That is an international assessment. And the sooner that occurs and the bloodshed ends, the better it will be for everyone.
State Department officials say there have been other similar letters from Gaddafi before. This one was passed from Gaddafi to senior State Department official Jeffrey Feltman and then passed on to the White House. In defiance, Gaddafi says you can't build democracy with missiles and aircraft, or by supporting the opposition, which he calls, quote, armed members of al-Qaeda. And in another odd moment from this Gaddafi letter, he tells President Obama, "We still pray that you continue to be president of the U.S.A." Wolf?
Very weird. What else do we know about the letter? Was it handwritten by any chance?
No, it was actually typed, or, you know, it could have been on a computer. And how did it get here? Well, we believe, we do not know, but the indications are that the way other letters have come from senior officials from the Gaddafi regime, which is usually by fax to the State Department.
Well, they can have a fax machine in Tripoli to the State Department. Very cool. All right, thanks very much for that. A former U.S. lawmaker who's developed close ties to Libya over the years is in Tripoli right now at the invitation of Muammar Gaddafi, the ex-congressman from Pennsylvania. Kurt Weldon plans to meet with Libya's leader. He says he'll propose a ceasefire and he'll tell Gaddafi face-to-face, his words, that it's time for him to leave. Let's bring in the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, the New York Times columnist, Nicholas Kristof, to discuss this and more. You read that op-ed by Kurt Weldon in your newspaper, the New York Times, today. What did you think?
I don't think that there's a very good chance that Weldon will be able to persuade Gaddafi to go. I think that what we're seeing is the Gaddafi family is desperate, and they're really trying a bunch of different avenues to try to figure out what they can do to work out a deal. And one is inviting Weldon in. One is sending his son Saif, his aide, to London to try to work out a deal. We're trying to work out a deal with the Greeks, and then sending this extraordinary letter to President Obama, which it sure felt to me was actually really written by Muammar Gaddafi himself. It
sounds like Gaddafi, given the weirdness of it, referring to him as my son. I hope you get reelected. You're killing me, but I hope you're doing an excellent job. Forget about all that.
Yeah, and I mean, Gaddafi did learn English as a young man. He speaks English, not very well, and I'd say, you know, his English is about the caliber of that letter, and it didn't seem it was really proofread by anybody who spoke English well, or else the proofreaders didn't have the guts to say to Gaddafi, you might want to correct your spelling and your grammar. So it felt to me like it was really coming directly from Gaddafi, and...
Yeah, on this Kurt Weldon visit, I've been in touch with him throughout the day. I haven't spoken directly to him, but I have spoken to some people close to him. You know, I think, you know, he's had a long-standing relationship for years now as a former congressman while he was in Congress with Gaddafi. He's proposing, he proposed it in the New York Times, that Saif al-Islam Gaddafi take over, really. Muammar Gaddafi step down and Saif al-Islam work out a deal with the opposition. Is that at all realistic?
I don't think it's realistic that Saif stay on, but I do think that there is some real chance of a negotiation, some kind of a deal. I think that it is plausible, for example, that the Gaddafi family take $10 million and move off to Uganda, to Mali, and then, for example, maybe not members of the Gaddafi family, but the nominal head of state is actually a very close Gaddafi friend, who is the head of the parliament. And if that person were to remain in charge, you know, maybe that would be okay with the rebels.
And this notion of partitioning Libya, what they're now calling a two-state solution, we're not talking about Israel and Palestine, we're talking about two parts of Libya. Some people are floating that idea out there right now. What do you think of that?
I don't think that Libyans will go for that. I don't think that is viable. But I think that it is good that Weldon is there, and I think it's important that we have as many channels as we can back and forth and have people who are telling Gaddafi the truth, that he's just not going to be able to stay on. One of the real problems with dictators, and we also saw that in Ivory Coast, is that dictators don't get good information because they're surrounded by sycophants. And I hope that that message will get to Gaddafi, that he has no future in Libya.
What do you make of the rebels now bitterly complaining that NATO is missing in action? Where is NATO, they keep saying, now that the United States has handed over complete responsibility to NATO? They're not seeing the airstrikes, they're not seeing the Tomahawk cruise missiles, and they're bitter about it. At least our reporters in Benghazi are telling us that.
Well, if I were a rebel, I'd be complaining too, and it does seem to be working in the sense that NATO does seem to be stung by this criticism, and it says that it had more sorties today, that it'll have even more tomorrow. Clearly, the weather is one constraint on them. It is harder when it's cloudy. Another constraint is that there are fewer tanks being used by the Gaddafi forces and, you know, more mortars, for example, and it's a lot harder to hit a mortar than to hit a tank. But I mean, frankly, I share the rebels' sort of bewilderment that around Misrata. Why isn't there more pressure on the Gaddafi forces that are moving into Misrata? I think that's a valid question.
I loved your column the other day about the inconsistency in U.S. policy. It's better to be inconsistent and save at least some lives than to be consistent and let a whole lot of innocent people die. In a nutshell, tell our viewers what you wrote.
Well, I think that, you know, a lot of people say, well, we're not intervening in places in Africa, in Darfur, in Ivory Coast, and that there's a real inconsistency here. And I think, you know, absolutely, we have to plead guilty. But at the end of the day, I don't think that Libyans should suffer because we made Rwandans suffer. And at the end, you know, that fundamentally it's better to inconsistently save some lives than to consistently save none.
At Nick Kristof, if you want to follow him on Twitter, more than 1 million people are following you on Twitter. Nick, you got a lot of followers, a lot of fans out there. Thanks very much. We'll stay in close touch with you, and we'll obviously follow you on Twitter and read your column in the New York Times.